Now that we've done our homework in the area of historical observations, getting acquainted with the topography of Israel relative to Amos' ministry, now that we have engaged in at least a few sample literary observations and done a high-altitude overview of the book in the form of a logical outline, we're in a better position to make some observations concerning the theological message of this important book. As you can tell, there are significant critiques which the prophet articulates against the northern kingdom. That will form a very important part of the theological messages that we observe. First of all, God weighs in against bribery in the environment of the judicial system. Second, economically, he observes that there is oppression being exercised. Third, when it comes to people's religion, their spirituality, hypocrisy is on the loose. And then a devastating comment assessing their spiritual sensitivity as being very, very hollow and empty. Let's take a look at these in review. And what we'll do is focus on just one or two sample verses that illustrate this principle. When it comes to the judicial system, there was bribery rampant. You oppress the righteous and take bribes, and you deprive the poor of justice in the courts. Before passing on to the next verse, try to absorb how horrific is this description. The righteous should not be oppressed. They are the sort of persons of character on which a community can be built, and yet people are taking advantage of them. People are depriving them of what is rightfully theirs and making life difficult. In the courts, they were taking bribes. So justice was being derailed through the use of paid decisions in court. And those who don't have the money to do that, the poor, don't find any justice. It's just completely evil. Chapter 2, verse 6 has a little snippet that contributes to this negative picture. Amos declares, "They sell the righteous for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals." How about the economic sector? How is Northern Israel behaving when it comes to fairness in the marketplace? It's not present. Instead, according to chapter 8, skimping the measure, boosting the price, cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with the wheat. Chapter 2, verse 7, another brief vignette. They trample on the heads of the poor. How is Northern Israel faring when it comes to their spirituality? Well, we find out that they are active, but the ways in which they are active are just abhorrent to God. Earlier, we made comment on this question, which is quoted from the people. Impatiently they inquire, "When will the new moon be over?" And why? "So that we may sell grain." "When will the Sabbath be ended?" Why? "So that we may market wheat." If we were to put that in terms of a modern situation, it would be as if someone is sitting in a Sunday morning worship service, aware that they can go out as soon as the service is over and somehow trade stock or sell real estate or somehow engage in merchandising just as they would Monday through Friday. There's a particularly painful description of spirituality gone just terribly awry in chapter 2, verse 7 and following. "Father and son use the same girl and so profane my name. You may be aware that in some of the competing religions of that era and that locale, there was a thought that somehow actual agricultural productivity could be boosted. The maize or the wheat would become more productive if the people on a human level would engage in sexual activity far beyond the bounds that God intended within a marriage between a man and a woman. And that's what's being alluded to here. The passage goes on to read, they lie down, so that would be illicit activities, beside every altar. It's connected with spirituality, the spiritual practice. Now, please know this is nothing that God authorized. It was the competitive religions, pagan religions in the area that were promulgating this very twisted theology. They lie down on garments taken in pledge. We learned from the Pentateuch that God arranged if someone needed to borrow money, they might put down some collateral, some kind of security. And now it was vital if the person was in a destitute condition that the creditor was not allowed to take their garment, because after all that's equivalent to their blanket, and they would shiver in the cold at night if the creditor was so cruel as to require that their garment, their cloak, was left as collateral. But notice these. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. This is saying not only is their sexual activity twisted, but how they conduct themselves economically and how they farm out their money in loans. This is done to harm the people from whom they're borrowing. In the house of their God, so they do have some spirituality, but it's not the God of Israel, they drink wine taken as fines. So spiritual practice, yes, they did things that were of a religious sort, but they were twisted, they were empty, and they were just very reprehensible to God. Here's how God responds to that particular chapter of their practice. He declares, I hate, and if that doesn't carry the message, I despise your religious feasts. Sure, you're taking time to observe festivals, but I can't stand it. I'm nowhere near the territory where you think that I am when you claim to be going through these exercises. I will not accept your burnt offerings. And then he indicates what should be going on instead. Let justice roll on. And the passage continues, let justice roll on like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You may recall this picture that we saw earlier. In the northern part of Israel, there were streams that would roll, and perhaps it was a picture that people would imagine such as this when they heard Amos declaring that justice must be free-flowing and abundant, just like this river. Sadly, that was not the case. There's a particularly gripping indictment in chapter 6, which we could call an general atmosphere of spiritual paralysis. Woe to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria. You do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. Think about the culture that you belong to. I'm thinking about my culture. Are there things going on that if we were more in tune to God's expectations, His standards, we should be grieving over them? There are messages in Amos that we must take to heart. And he goes on to say, therefore, because of this paralysis, this insensitivity, you will be among the first to go into exile. Some minutes back, we commented on the day of the Lord, and here is an important piece of corrective theology that is articulated through Amos. Previously, the day of the Lord was looked forward to by the people of God as a day when they would be vindicated. Oppressors under whose heel they had been ground into the dust would be cast off, and God would bring victory to his people. However, Amos says, you will not benefit from the day of the Lord. Why is that? Well, frankly, as we've seen, whether it be in the judicial system or in economics or in their spiritual practices, they themselves are the oppressors. So the day of the Lord for them will be an appointment in divine court, and the evidence is very, very strong against them. It will be then a terror for Israel. Another important dimension as we examine the messages of Amos from a theological vantage is the question, what's the character of God which is revealed in this book? Here's a quick overview of just a few features which are used to illuminate the character of God. You'll recall that early on in chapter 1, the Lord roars, and so he is presented with the imagery of an aggressive animal, one that should strike terror into the hearts of those who are going against him. Chapter 9, God is presented in Amos as a judge. Indeed, much of the book seems to carry this litigious overtone, the sense of a judicial encounter. We also meet him as creator. And finally, in the end, that small wisp of hope, he is the restorer. In terms of his interaction with his servant, Amos, God shows himself to be one who reveals his plans, and Amos makes a point of this. That becomes part of his qualification for speaking on God's behalf. In fact, this is a message which he cannot keep inside. He must declare, because he has heard God speak. Now let's think about how the book of Amos can be viewed with an eye to application. Routinely, we want to begin to imagine ourselves in the sandals of the original hearers and think, as these messages struck their ears, how was God hoping that they would respond? They would hear these words of warning, and it would remind them of the fact that if they persisted in violating God's expectations, eventually judgment would come, and it would come in the shape as if a lion, a shape in which they could not avoid it. It did not matter whether or not they had high standing in terms of religious or spiritual recognition among people around them, pedigree. They would be accountable for adhering to God's standards. And then there is this challenge in pointed fashion: seek the Lord, and that will lead the way to really living. Do not seek Bethel with all the ramifications or the overtones of false religious activities. The word that's used to encourage the people to seek the Lord is the word darash, and here are some of the overtones of this word. Frequenting a place, you seek a place, or you might seek out a person. It has the idea at times of consulting, such as perhaps seeking the opinion of a prophet or seeking the opinion of a wise person, investigating something, and seeking with an intent to actually follow up, to apply, not just to dally around the edges. This is distinct from a different verb which belongs to the same general semantic family, bakash, which has the idea of seeking to meet someone, an encounter, or perhaps seeking to acquire or possess something. So darash is an interesting word and is helpful in Amos in transmitting the message of really pursuing God. There's also a message of comfort, as we've seen, and the application here would be for people to hang on to a shred of hope that God one day would restore them. How about for us today? Now, routinely we want to fashion the modern application as closely as possible, with as much fidelity as possible, to the ancient application. And that way, The dynamism of the original prophecy will impact us and shape us just as the Holy Spirit would have. And so we want to review the arenas where northern Israel was going wrong. What about in the courts today? Do the poor receive justice? Now, we may not be individuals who have opportunity to shape the courts, except perhaps through elections and choosing officials, or perhaps we have friendships. There may be circles of influence, or there may be justice of an informal nature. We may not be part of a judicial system, but perhaps there's justice in the workplace or other arenas where we can be agents of fairness, especially for the poor, because they are the ones who are vulnerable. How about the infirm and the elderly, or the very young? Are we advocates for these when it comes to justice? Then there's the marketplace. To whatever degree we have influence, are we helping assure that wages for others are just? Perhaps we're in a management position and we have an opportunity to influence this. There must be fairness. Or when it's providing goods and services, do we conduct ourselves in the economic realm with fairness? And then when it comes to spiritual practice, are we concentrating primarily on just following the Sabbath, following the new moon? Well, for us today, practices of formalism, following letterism, or are we following God from the heart? Do we misbehave, quietly assuming that God is blind? Do I think of God as somehow ignorant? Do I have the notion that I can behave as I wish with just an outward veneer of adherence to His principles? Do I think that I can fool Him into leaving me alone if I just put $1 in the plate and attend church regularly? Or do I acknowledge Him as Amos declares, the one who forms the mountains, who creates the wind and reveals His thoughts to men? He who turns dawn to darkness and treads the high places of the earth. The Lord Almighty is His name. In another lecture, I commended to you the viewpoint of A.W. Tozer when he declares this about our understanding of God. He declared, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Amos would sit down with us and ask us, what is our view of God? The people in his day had a very atrophied view of God, thinking they could get away with anything. If that's my view of God, it's a form of idolatry. I have formed God into an image of my own convenience. I must just jettison that and embrace God for who He really is, and let Him be the one who reveals Himself, and let me take a position of following Him as a disciple.